Welcome, everyone, to the resumption of the Movements of Movements conversation. My name is Suren Mudliar. I am one of the coordinators of the Encuentro Cinco movement building space in Boston, Massachusetts. It is an ecumenical project of the broad left seeking to unite theory and organizing across issues and movements. We have therefore partnered with the Movements of Movements project to build its web space and also activities like this one as political spaces for reflection and for strategizing. If the first two volumes of the Movements of Movements project reflected the political realities of our global movements in the first 2 decades of the century, may these ongoing conversations do the same for the opening of the third decade. As we gather, if you'll forgive a US-centric observation, federal police are fanning out across the cities in an attempt to provoke violence and to suppress the rebellion bannered by the declaration that Black Lives Matter. Gone is the pretense of US exceptionalism, at least insofar as its always suspect claims of democracy and upward mobility. But of course, the ruling class is responding, albeit cynically, to the movements of the people. It is to those movements and their initiatives that this conversation will turn. To help us through this conversation, Joy Sen and Hina Vargas will be the facilitators. I will now hand off the mic to Hina Vargas, who joins us from Peru. Hina.
Comienzo. I began.
Please.
Sorry. Bueno, primero, no voy a hablar en castellano porque no logramos la traducción, pues no tenemos recursos. That means that I'm going to speak in English. My English is not so bad, but well, it's a kind of Spanglish. So I hope you can follow me, and the next time we will have a Spanish translation. Well, I will briefly refer to the current context we are facing of a deep crisis in Western civilization that reveals the contradiction between a predatory economy model and the sustainability of life in our planetary ecosystem. Faced with this serious situation, a major conviction emerged that this civilization, as we know it and live it, cannot continue as it is, since its very foundations are collapsing. But in the meanwhile, death, murder, repression, and terror is its actual behavior, and the global pandemic that we are experiencing gives us a dramatic mirror of this situation. If the pandemic has exposed the miseries in the life of the majority of the planet, indigenous people, Black women, informal workers, sex workers, a sense of unacceptable inequality has also arisen due to the scandalous number of people that live homeless, without work, without food, due to the sense of horror at the outrageous white supremacy that murdered George Floyd, which has led to recognize that racism is a global epidemic. It is in our lives, it is in our society, it is in our countries, and to change this is something that we don't achieve overnight, because it is not only pointing to others, but seeing when our own racism and our indifference maintains it. Vilma Piedade, a Brazilian Black feminist, has turned sorrow into an epistemic category. If the sorrow of machismo impacts all women, she says, when we talk about a Black woman, there is something that deepens this sorrow. The pain caused by racism. That pain is Black, but it is not just adding race with class, with the gender or sexuality, but rather a dispute for recognition or deconstructing that power in ourselves and in others. Moreover, in this pandemic, there is an environmental racism that is affecting, for example, Black and Indigenous people more than anybody. There is an explicit viral extermination of Black and Indigenous people given by Bolsonaro in Brazil, defining which lives are those that deserve to live and which are not. And more even, in the last meeting of the Saving the Amazon, they said the Amazon is saying, I cannot breathe. In other words, it is undoubtedly a change not only onwards, it's a profound subjective and deeply political change in all of us. We know that a common ethos seems to exist between us, the confrontation of capitalism, patriarchalism, racism, and coloniality as a whole, the recognition of interdependence and eco-dependence is what is feeding the movements all over the world. In this pandemic, we have seen in all countries signs of care towards others and ourselves. Networks of solidarity support are woven. Visions of change are connected. A dense network of local cooperation, of reciprocity and exchange, diverse expressions of social economy, popular economy, collective action are developing, which are foreshadowing new dynamics of interrelation. We are not alone. Today, from a multiplicity of struggles and resistance, a deep epistemic disobedience has been opened that recovers new imaginaries, complicating and enriching not only the referential horizon, but impacting the dominant vision of the world, the production of knowledge, the daily life and of society and political, and obviously the current economic model. Our strategies of struggle connecting them, reviving the categories that the dynamics of movements are giving us as loyalty in struggle, solidarity in action, raising mutual aid, listening and learning without a doubt, but also deconstructing the unequal power that movement also may contain. We are not alone, but we are always many more. A movement of movements is permanently enriched with other sides, other voices, with younger people. I am not suggesting only to bring them here if they want, but rather I am suggesting that we are there in their concerns, their new ways of mobilization and struggle. Have to be in our this has to be in our horizon of change. The sorrow persists in the vast majority of the population until dignity becomes an habit, as the last Chilean mobilization for change of life have said. This is time for revolt in action, but also in imagination, coming from connective and collective action, contributing to new agendas that fight against racism, sexism, misogyny, exploitation, very much articulated to the struggle of defense of our territories against extractivism, defending our bodies, and avoiding to go back to toxic normality with the control of neo-fascist forces and Eurocentric and white supremacy. Finally, which are the questions that we ask ourselves in this new scenario? Where to go? It's hard to know. Maybe a step is recognizing that what we knew no longer serves us by itself to know more. And perhaps that should be the way of knowing, because only believing in the incompleteness of our knowledge is that we can recognize our quality pair and therefore our interdependence with other struggles and voices. Sorry for my English, it's okay. Yeah, it's not the hearing.
Joy, you're muted.
Okay, it kept muting back, so unmuting. So here I am. Um, I'm Joy Sen. I'm taking the next step. Thank you so much, Hina, for your opening words and for, if you like, setting this broad forest of a landscape that we are entering today. I'm here in kind of two capacities. One as one of the co-organizers of this event, along with Suren Mudliar, with Hina Vargas and Matt Mayer, who will be speaking later. And on behalf of all of them, I'd like to join all of you and to welcome all of you to this event and to what we hope will be an unfolding process, which will be a contribution to the movements of movements that Hina spoke of. I'm going to speak particularly about the event itself, its organization, and please bear with me. I want to both step back and then step forward. The first is that we want you to know that we have consciously organized this event as an intervention in emerging world social movement and emerging world politics. As all of you know, there have been many, many initiatives that have been taken by different entities across the world in all kinds of languages in virtual space because of all being locked down. And in a way, this has been a gift of this time, despite all the oppression. It's our way of breaking through, of linking across and seeing what sharing we can do. And there have been many, many thematic webinars, lectures, webinars, discussions that have taken place. What we want to do here is let me make one other point. This, as Hina has also said, in many ways, the last 4 or 5 months have changed the world entirely. And it's though some people talk about going back to normality, as she said, most people have no wish to go back to that normality, precisely because the veins of capitalism, of neoliberalism, colonialism, racism, patriarchy have been laid bare by this epidemic. And its absolute violence that all of these have inflicted on all of us. So it's been a huge learning moment. And I think it's very important to recognize that we are not the only people, of course, who are learning from this. Ordinary people everywhere, men and women, are learning from this. And these ideas are going viral in their own way. So in a way, we need to join ordinary people in their understanding of what they are doing and how to cope with this in the way that Hina mentioned of mutual aid, of survival under the circumstances, and then building resistance and rebellion in the course of this. The second thing that's also taken place, of course, as we know, is that most spectacularly, though there have been eruptions all around the world, in the United States, there has been this enormous eruption, which is now widely recognized as being perhaps the largest movement that's ever taken place in the US, which has always been a country of rebellion, led in this case by peoples of African descent. So it is one of the first times in history, perhaps, that we have seen this situation emerging, where it is the structurally, historically suppressed who are leading the movement and leading in terms of imagination and in terms of tactics, and being joined by sections from all other sections of society. So we are living through a historic moment. So this, in that sense, and coming back to my point, we wanted to organize an event where we could have a sharing, a conversation, to use a very polite word, of views from people who are within this movement and uprising in the United States with people who come from other parts of the world, so we can have an open and frank exchange about what the nature of the world is today. So we have, therefore, two sets of people here. One is we have 6 contributors to the to this, to the Movements of Movements, which is a set of books. Excuse my phone. So the six are Hina Vargas from Peru, Guillermo Delgado P, who's from Bolivia but now based in the US, Lawrence Cox from Ireland, Matt Mayer from the US, Michal Osterweil, also from the US, and Osenia Alidou from Niger, and based both in Niger and the US. So we have already a spread there from different parts of the world. This happened as a result of our extending an invitation to all the contributors, for about 50 plus contributors to the books, The Movements of Movements, and where 7 or 8 of them volunteered, and we finally have 6 here. In addition, as invited speakers, we have 2 people, Rose Brewer, as somebody intensively rooted in the massive emerging movements that are taking place in the US right now, and also a scholar of movement, who will open the discussion for us and set the scene. And then she will be followed by the 6 speakers who are contributors from the books. And this in turn will be followed by Johanna Fernandez, again, somebody intensively rooted in the current eruptions in the United States, and also a scholar. And she will engage with what the speakers have said and what Rose has said, and try and pull it together and set the stage for further discussion. You can get details on each of these people on the website, The Movements of Movements. Each is an extraordinary person with an extraordinary background and contributions to knowledge, literature, and movement. Unfortunately, Rose has to leave for another meeting at noon, and so won't be here for the question answer session that will follow, but we have given her a little more time so she can, in the opening, take that time. We'll be introducing each speaker as we invite them to speak. But I want to underline that this event is therefore an opportunity for all of us, just as we've invited the speakers to take this opportunity, to stand back from the front lines and to look at what is the nature and the meaning of the moment that we are today at, and what is it offering us. So the first thing is to stand back. The second is to draw lessons from the movements that are taking place and that people will be speaking about. And to look strategically at what our objectives and goals have been and should be, including in terms of gaining power to, developing our power to, and also gaining and developing power over. And thirdly, we hope that it will be a part of the exercise of what the books themselves tried to critically look at and talk across movements. For those who joined later, I want to emphasize again, there's a couple of books I had the privilege of editing called The Movements of Movements. You can find it on the website called themovementsofmovements.net. It's easy to look up, published by PM Press. Finally, I'll just quickly summarize this structure of this event. After this, there's going to be a brief interlude in tribute to some of the contributors of the books who have worked on in these years immediately before this. Second, there will be a plenary session for about 40 minutes with 7 speakers, starting with Rose and then followed by the 6 speakers to the book, where each will, one after the other, be speaking. We will then have the comments on the plenary presentation by Johanna Fernandez for 5 minutes. There will then be an open house for 20-25 minutes of questions, answers, and more, which will be moderated. Suren Mudlial will be clubbing questions, putting them to us as the hosts, as the moderators, and then by and large, we'll probably be phrasing those questions to speakers. If there's an opportunity, we may ask somebody, some people to speak, but it's going to be tight, so we'll probably phrase them. Finally, there is a closing session of looking ahead, where we have some proposal to put before you. I again apologize that this event is only in English. Unfortunately, this is entirely a volunteer and voluntary-led process. We have no resources other than our labor and love. So, but we hope in the next event, which we will be announcing, where where we will be able to perhaps offer translation at least into Spanish. I'd like to end by again warmly thanking my co-organizers for getting this event together, and particularly for honoring the books that I was so privileged to edit. And especially I'd like to thank Suren Mudlia and his colleagues at Encuentro Cinco for not only hosting this event, but hosting the website and the books that we have there, which are available at a discount price. Thank you all. I hope that my presentation was clear. I apologize for any lack of clarity. Please give me feedback if you like. I've missed one or two points. Let me mention to it. Firstly, Suren has just given you the website of the Movements of Movements website and the link on this chat. Secondly, we'd like to invite everybody who is now attending to put your names and your contact details on chat so that we can be in touch with you more directly in future. Some of you have come through Zoom. We have some record of that, but not necessarily your contact details, and those through Facebook, not, and word of mouth, even less. We don't have those details. So please do let us have your name and contact details if you like your organization as well, and where you're from. Okay, so we move to the second stage, which is the tribute to the contributors. At one level, this gathering is the first ever live gathering of contributors to the books. As I said earlier, there are about 55 contributors from around the world who contributed to the Movements of Movements. The first book was titled What Makes Us Move, and the second one was subtitled Rethinking Our Dance. They were published in 2017 and 18 by PM Press. And because the books took nearly 10 years to put together, for me, as compiler and editor, the contributors in a way became a kind of imagined community that I was working with over 10 years. I'm therefore delighted today that some of those contributors are here today, the 6 speakers who are already mentioned, but in addition, we have 2 or 3 others who I know are online, Ashok Chaudhary, Jeffrey Players, and Eric Milon. There may be others. Please do come on chat and announce yourself. That would be nice. But the other side of this is that in these 10 years, some of our contributors have walked on, have passed on, to use another phrase. And so we'd like to take just a moment to remember them and their contributions to the books. I'm going to mention just them briefly. For those interested in knowing more, please look up the document on the Movements of Movement, the website, titled In Tribute and Memory, where there are more details given. So I remember warmly here and pay tribute to Daniel Ben Said, who walked on January 12, 2010. He was one of the key participants in the historic May 1968 movement in France, when he was a student at the University of Nanterre as an activist in the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, and where he remained a key theorist and strategist throughout his life. And if I'm not wrong, the essay that we have in his book is perhaps one of the last things that he produced. Second, I should be pausing for a minute between each. I want to remember Fouad Kalouche, who walked on October 20th, 2016. At the time of his premature death, the late Fouad Kalouche was Associate Professor of Philosophy at Albright College in Reading in Pennsylvania in the US. He wrote on theories of transformation, political subjectivation, and social ontology. He died of drowning in Cuba while trying to save 2 children The children were saved, but he could not be. His essay is co-authored with Eric Milon, who I think is present with us today. The third contributor who's passed on was Francois Huttard, who walked on June 6, 2017. The late Francois Huttard was so many things: Catholic priest, liberation theologian, internationalist, and scholar of movements. I can't possibly do him justice here. He was the founder of CETRI, the Centre Tricontinental, former chair of the International League for the Liberation of the Peoples, an expert for Vatican Council II, vice chair of the World Forum for Alternatives, and he's also regarded as one of the initiators of the World Social Forum. He published over 40 books, and he contributed 2 essays in the Movements of Movements book. The next is Peter Waterman, who walked on June 17, 2017. The late Peter Waterman was especially special for me. Excuse me. My very close friend and comrade. He was also apologies. He was also co-contributor on other books and co-editor of 3 other books we did, and the contributing editor for the Movements of Movements books. He was throughout a scholar, a labor internationalist, a debater, and a feminist. And he was also the partner and companion spirit of Hina Vargas. Peter taught for many years at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and where, among other things, and teaching, he was also the initiator of the trailblazing newsletter of International Labor Studies. And after retiring, he published many monographs, but in particular, his extraordinary autobiography called From Cold War Communism to the Global Emancipatory Movement, Itinerary of a Long-Distance Internationalist. 2 more people, Samir Amin, who walked on August 12, 2018. The late Samir Amin was director of the Third World Forum, chair of the World Forum Alternatives, an economist and intellectual, and he was widely and still is regarded as one of the foremost thinkers in the changing dynamics of capitalism. He was actively associated with the World Social Forum from its inception, as well as with regional fora. Finally, Jeff Juris, another young person who walked on June 18th, 2020, just a few months ago, just a month ago. At the time of his premature death, late Jeff Juris was associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in Northeastern University in Boston. Along with many articles, he was the author of Networking Futures, the Movements Against Corporate Globalization. And towards the end of his life, he was working on a new book about free media and autonomy in Mexico. As a personal note, I'll add that even though he'd been diagnosed with being seriously unwell, he nevertheless joined me in doing 2 book launches for the Movements of Movements in June and October 2018. So I'm sorry for taking so long. I apologize for breaking down. I would like you to just remember these people as we move on. We now move to the plenary session where each speaker will be giving a presentation. We start with, and I'll be introducing each one briefly. The first I want to introduce and have great pleasure in introducing is Rose Brewer, scholar activist, um, uh, and radical intellectual. She's the Morse alumni, a distinguished teaching professor of African American and African Studies in the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. She's extensively written on radical Black feminism, social movements, race, class and gender, and social change. She's authored and co-authored several books and edited volumes, including the U.S. Social Forum, Perspectives of a Movement, and the recently co-edited volume, Rod Bush, Lessons from a Black Radical Scholar on Liberation, Love, and Justice. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you so much, Joy, and welcome to all of you for joining us this morning, whether it's morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you're coming in to this webinar. It is certainly a pleasure to be on the panel this morning. Very much appreciate, Joy, your very moving recognition of those who have transitioned and who have brought so much to what we will say and what we build on in this morning, for me, conversation. The radical artist and civil rights activist Bernice Johnson Reagan invoked the civil rights movement as the borning struggle of that time. We are in the borning struggle of this time in the wake of the Floyd Rebellion. The fight for Black lives continues in Minneapolis and globally. The dynamic in the US has shifted as we confront the militarized response to protests that actually began during the Floyd Rebellion. We experienced tear gas, rubber and live bullets, military garbed and not, hurt, pain, and violence. Now Portland and likely other cities as Trump extends his authoritarian reach through Operation Legend, federal officers slated for Chicago, Albuquerque, and others, armed forces in the streets of the US. The Portland protesters, of course, continue to fight furiously. The women assert, quote, our streets, as they link arms and push the federal agents into their holes. Right-wing nationalism, proto-fascism articulated through Trumpism, proceeds apace, forcing labor to return to work, quelling protests, demanding schools open, and catalyzing the triage of COVID-19 as 4 million cases explode in the US with 144,000 deaths. And these are just the official statistics. By all accounts, a deep underestimate. But the rise up continues. June 20th, a strike for Black lives. Many Black and brown women in the low paid, risky jobs now called essential, operating as a class, demanding change. Tens of thousands of people in the US have been involved in struggle against some aspect of the system under the banner of Black Lives Matter. We march against racist police murders of Black bodies and gentrification. We fight for a living wage, for workers' rights, housing, care, health, education, life for the people and the planet. We fight for political transformation in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. Global resistance is an affirmation of our humanity and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. The question is, what will it take to transform the whole society? What moves must we make to bring us closer to political change? How can we use our strengths to move against the other side's weaknesses, building that strategic block? It is truly the fire this time, as another generation articulates the best of the Black revolutionary tradition, abiding by the great African revolutionary Franz Fanon's command, quote, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Another generation is hearing Fanon's call, taking their place in the pantheon of Black liberation, whether in South Africa or the US or throughout the African world, in relationality within global solidarity with the world's peoples, fighting for a just order. In assessing today's rebellion, it is clear the intellectual and political will of those committed to human liberation are stretched thin as humanity confronts the logic of transnational crises, ecological, economic, social. Moreover, the current period requires complex theoretical and practical understanding of complicated intersectional and movement building. Just as historically, it means confronting a profit-driven system, a world system, and it is a system in deep crises today. During the pandemic, millions of people in the US and more globally are unemployed, without health care, direly Black, brown within the US, as well as indigenous, die. The continued conflicts and wars globally are the faces of a neo-imperial order rooted in global capitalism. This is not the end of the story. You need to know the deep disparities in Minneapolis, Minnesota, my home, epicenter of the Floyd Rebellion, on the term reign of white liberalism, where there are Black neighborhoods with 30% or more of the working age population without jobs, with police violence, occupation, and incarceration plague. How dare they ask why the Floyd Rebellion? How dare the question is posed, given a capitalist city rooted in protecting property and profit in white liberal Minneapolis. Indeed, fewer and fewer Black people are needed in the everyday operation of late capitalism. This has been true for a very long time now. Just as canaries in the mine shaft, Black labor displacement signals that fewer workers overall are needed given racial capitalism's structure. Chillingly, today, where Black labor is most exploited and appropriated, given this neoliberal logic, is in mass incarceration, cheap prison labor with all its snares of exclusion, massive COVID deaths, prison nation filled with political prisoners. Where now? People in resistance in the US and globally are occupying public space, building mutual aid, making common ground where the people share cooperative lives. We build community. Taking a page from the theoretical work of the movements of movements, we assert the need for linked struggles, national and global strategy, multiple layers of alignment, small changes circulating through movement networks with large changes provoked, and of course, front-on battle, direct action. This is what building of movements entails. We're in a moment of great urgency and possibility. It's a righteous moment as another generation stands in the ready and operate in opposition to everything this country has stood for: racism, white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy, capitalism. Yet, the strong people keep coming. Drawing from the gifted words of poet Langston Hughes, strong people keep coming. Strong people keep coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you for that very, very moving and broad landscape for us and challenge. I am personally very sorry that you will have to be leaving us before too long, but thank you so much for joining us, making the time for doing so today. We hope we can build on what you say. And we hope we can continue the conversation with you in this forum and in other fora in this discussion and in this struggle. I'd now like to invite Matt Mayer to speak. Matt is a New York-based educator activist. He's Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, the author most recently of White Lives Matter Most and Other Little White Lies, and co-editor with Deki Kioni Sadiki, or Look for Me in the Whirlwind, from the Panther 21 to 21st Century Revolutions. He also serves as co-convener of the War Resisters International Africa Working Group, is chair of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation Financial Advisory Committee, and the UN NGO representative of the International Peace Research Association. Matt, please speak.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Rose. Physics teaches us that the concepts of space and time are more mutable, fluid, bendable than we typically understand them to be. As noted, astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson challenged US citizens in response to the global COVID-19 pandemic, will people listen to science? And Lenin famously noted, there are decades when it seems like nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Perhaps today, this very Friday, it is important to locate our moment, even before we reflect upon what is to be done. I've recently qualified this period in the US as a moment at war. To be sure, it is neither a new war nor one about to end, but it has entered a new phase within the backdrop of the dying US empire. The US executive branch has deployed troops against state governments, which are perceived as oppositional to the current regime and to longstanding practices of militarized policing. The troops are new. The practices of repressing policing are not. Federal policies relating to healthcare, especially in response to this pandemic, spotlight an extremely racialized, class-based schism, whereby herd immunity and the question of reopening aspects of society equate to mass murder of at least tens of thousands of predominantly Black, brown, indigenous, and poor people. The speed and scale of COVID-related death is new. Genocidal policies based on white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism are not. The economic crisis, spurred on by this perfect storm of factors, has led to a global downturn, which the empire as such cannot recover from. But an end of US ability to fulfill its former imperial dreams does not mean an end to US aggression, externally or internally, as a prison house of nations, as Rose mentioned. The weakening of the US is new. The manner in which the brunt of this collapse will be borne on the backs of predominantly Black and brown women, the center of actual productive work, is not. Therefore, it should be no surprise that we have happily witnessed and taken part in Black liberation uprisings marking these last months, with mass street actions, cross-generational conversations, and strategic thinking within the US left, which has been dormant for decades. Though improperly and inexactly being called a Black Lives Matter movement, the inspiration and solidarity evidenced by these uprisings can be seen as a truly global phenomena. The triple crisis of COVID-19 pandemic, white supremacist imperial militarism, and barbarous capitalist containment provide opportunities for movement building as of yet unprecedented in this century. We must be careful not to too quickly confuse and declare hopeful moments or militant actions with entire movements. And we must understand that this historic moment will require an understanding of the movements of movements, as defined and discussed in 2-book series edited by our dear Joyce Sen and on the new website, more than a single united front or political thread. We must understand, for example, that this moment at war is inextricably intertwined with the global war against Mother Earth, which has been waged across ideological lines by imperialists, the sub-imperial BRICS, and corporate looters everywhere. Countering these assaults is a new First Eco-Socialist International, founded in Venezuela, and also a new burgeoning decolonization movement led by still occupied and colonized people who are most profoundly connecting strategic, tactical, and conceptual issues of human and planetary liberation, from West Papua to Western Sahara, from Amazonia to Puerto Rico and Palestine. This burgeoning collection of freedom fighters is beginning to come to the fore. And in the politically underdeveloped US left, the new Black-led coalition People's Strike provides a promising set of possibilities across the lands, peoples, and histories of too often divided mass campaigns. And even more directly, within the Movements of Movements circles and website, the World Social Movements Discussion Group, whose threads can be found archived on the site, looks to shape continuing conversations about how we might rethink our dance and build new forms of resistance for lasting transformative change. Friends, comrades, it is not clear whether we can achieve our heady ambitions. It is clear, however, science and history has shown that we cannot achieve them unless we are in concrete, close, and strategic dialogue with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for this. Very stirring, I think, blast, if you like, that I think is opens up further questions yet. We'd now like to move to the third speaker, Gina Vargas. Gina is a sociologist and feminist activist in Peru and Latin America. She's also a member and founding member of Flora Tristan Center in Lima, and of the political current Marcosur Feminist Articulación in Latin America. She has published several books and many articles and has been a visiting professor at different universities in different parts of the world. At a global level, she participates actively in the World Social Forum from its inception on behalf of the Marcosur Feminist Articulation. Gina.
Thank you, Jai. I continue in English. I hope it's, you can follow it. Well, we live in a world on the move. For now, not on the streets, but in intense connection across borders, generating, as Matt Meyer points out in his contribution to this conversation, strategic thinking in the face of the current moment and in the uncertain and alarming moments that are now to come. It forces us to a moment of introspection, of new critical reflection and shared solidarity in political relation and daily life. It invites us to think beyond what we know or from we have learned in this moment. It's a moment of interregnum where the old is in decline, in collapse, and has not yet died, and the new is emerging, recovering what may be ways of foreshadowing other possible worlds as stated by the World Social Forum. And it is expressed in the resistance, the rebellion, the mobilization, the new subjectivities, the enormous ethnic, racial, sexual, and gender diversities, and new actors on the move, resisting returning to that normality that puts us here, a normality that wants to continue being and is expressed in a brutal way. Obscurantism, violent fundamentalism, fascism, violation of human rights, feminicides, extractivism, all morbid symptoms of the ruthless attempt to continue this normality of accumulation by the possession of lands, bodies, and territories, and to deepen contempt for human rights and the rights of Mother Earth. This reality makes it urgent to fit a civilization paradigm shift, recovering and building other imaginaries in our ways of organizing, thinking, perceiving ourselves and others, to locate the conditions to continue expanding and feeding the movements of movements, anchored in a pluriversal perspective that recognizes the legitimizes and makes and legitimizes all other possible worlds that seeks the sustainability of life, that fights for a life that deserves to be lived, that builds intercultural dialogues. Indigenous worldviews, Black worldviews, have enriched the horizon with a set of new epistemic, theoretical, and political categories, emerged and nurtured by experiences and imaginary of non-Western life, with words that have their own meanings and reevaluating denied relations. In doing so, they confront epistemic violence and structural racism that has historically kept them subordinated. Furthermore, they demonstrate that no group, worldview, or ethnic group has the right to impose their orientation, imagination, or production of knowledge, and even less to assume these knowledges as those that arrogates the centrality of their power. It is the affirmation of another way of seeing the world. Abya Yala instead of Latin America, recognizing that Latin America was a name put by the conquest people and not by the indigenous people. No? But more, we have the proposal of indigenous and Afro-Black worldwide that can give very important clues to face the capitalist, patriarchal, and colonial racist model. And this happens also in different continents. Good living or buen vivir in Abya Yala, a Quechua word referring to an ancestral worldview of life which affirms the collective nature of the realization of the human being and the right of an harmonious, balanced, ecologist, and ethical life that confronts the capitalist system. But also the same naming and meaning, we can find it in the word Ubuntu in Africa, Swahili in India, which shows that we cannot measure life with a single vision of the Western hegemonic world. All this opens up a very complex horizon of struggles because one dimension of the crisis cannot be confronted without simultaneously attacking all the others. And this is something that requires a space and cumulative force, recognizing the value of all the struggles. In this long time, only this connection or intersecting and articulated agendas and aspiration will strengthen the horizon of the movements. It is urgent to constantly nourish a change of civilization paradigm and the emergence of other parameters of organizing. Our agendas, broad and intersected, are oriented to the urgent articulation of the multiple struggles around gender, racial, sexual, economic, political, cultural, subjective, and emotional issues, from where they opt for change and to recover the ability to dream. And this process is underway. The dynamic of these diverse, vibrant voices plays, questioning a world dominated by values of profit and usury are not of well-being and care are crucial at this time, enriching an horizon of change, and they lead us to rethink our dance permanently, dramatically expanding the transformation agenda to collective and connective action, making evident even more profoundly the paradigm shifts that this contribution brings. And for me, as feminist, this is a proposal inscribed in the horizon of what we call feminists of the South. This view provides the possibility of reevaluating the knowledge practices of those who live beyond modern Western rationality, affirming that our place of enunciation is the South, understood not as a geographical place, but as an action and condition of subjects that gives fundamental importance to our local ways of developing practice and building knowledge, and our global way to accumulate more strength and diversity. This way of seeing, and without doubt, expands the dynamic and articulations permanently enriched from its intrinsic connection with the movement of movements. Yeah. Thank you.
Gracias, Ina. That's good of you and for bearing with us.
I
Asking.
suffer very much with the English, but sorry, with my heart.
No. Well, thank you. Your heart was there, and thank you so much for this presentation. I'd now like to invite Lawrence Cox to join us. Lawrence is a writer, activist, and teacher working with social movements in Ireland and globally. He's been involved in a wide range of struggles in various countries since the 1980s, including ecological activism, international solidarity, human rights, and organizing against repression, anti-war movements, community activism, radical media, self-organized spaces, alternative education, and others. He co-founded and co-edits the activist academic social movements journal called Interface, which I strongly recommend all of you look at, and Pluto Press's Social Movements Activist Research book series. Lawrence, please join us.
So, I'm not sure that we're winning. The system that we're up against has been in crisis for a rather long time. And we have seen wave after wave of movements against it. We have had some fantastic analyses of just what's wrong with it. Some very inspiring visions of a different future. But it's not clear that it's been enough. And it's not clear looking around the world, India, Brazil, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, China. The US is a wonderful source of hope for us at the moment on many dimensions: state power, ecology, race, women's rights, and so on. But it's not clear that we're winning. There's a disjuncture between our rhetoric and our capacity, and I want to talk about that briefly, because I think this project is really important, particularly in the dimension of learning from each other's struggles. What can we know, not through the master's tools, but from each other, about what we can do, what we have within our own capacity to make a difference? I'm going to talk about that briefly. So it seems to me in some ways movements own less of their own means of mental production, to quote Marx, than we did 20 years ago, never mind 50 years ago in the wake of 1968, never mind in the heyday of large organized workers' parties, trade unions, and so on. Very, very many of our thinkers write for the commercial press or commercial media, or in academic spaces, or profile themselves primarily on social media. These are the dominant institutions, not necessarily within movements, but certainly globally, through which we know each other's movements. So my own Irish media, never mind the American and British media, will tell me loads about what's going on in the States. I can read fantastic intellectual analyses of what is wrong with American racial violence, racial capitalism, and so on. Fantastic calls to action, wonderful visions of a new world. I can find very little about the intense organizing that has visibly gone on in the years since Ferguson, for example. Not, I'm sure, because those discussions aren't happening within the US, within individual cities, but because we no longer have the sort of means of production that talk to each other about these things. So if we think just about those dominant institutions that have really sucked so much of, it's not only the fault of those institutions, of course, but where so much of our discourse happens, commercial publishing, academia, social media, they are great for what old movements called agitation, convincing people who are not yet convinced that things are bad and you should do something about them, which is fine in talking to the outside world. It's very, very needed. They are pretty good at education in the sense of let's have a really hard-hitting analysis of how bad things are. Often, I want to say they seem to rather privilege the kind of analysis that's deeply cool, really complicated, and makes it seem as though you're very clever for thinking that it can't actually change. There's a certain saleability to that. What they do not privilege is what older movements called organizing. We do not have as much investment across our movements in talking about how do we organize, how do we win, what works, what is it that you guys are doing that is effective? Because that's what we need to know. Yeah? Once we're in the movements, we don't need to be agitated at, we don't need the rhetoric to be thrown at us again and again of how bad things are. We've probably also got more utopias and visions of the future coming out of our ears than we need. And we can certainly read any amount of really interesting books about how things work. But what we have very little of is serious discussion of what should we be doing. And we live in a broader perspective, I'll finish on this, in a sort of neoliberal niche culture where very often our participation in a given space means that we've already assumed a particular strategy for winning, be it an NGO strategy, a direct action strategy, an electoralist strategy, or whatever. When you open the pages of Jacobin, you know what you're going to get. Yeah? When you open an anarchist website, you know what you're going to get. You've already actually made that decision. So the learning across movements, across strategies, about what is actually working, we need more of that. We need to learn more from each other's struggles. And if this project can help us to develop a bit of that across countries, across different issues, across political traditions, we might be able to increase our own capacity to fight back and actually win a few things. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lawrence, for those very sobering words against the visions that came forward before, and very hard questions, but also your encouragement of an alternative praxis. And I think that, well, let's carry this forward. This is what we need to converse about. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Michal Osterweil to join us. Michal, if you're ready. Michal teaches global studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the US. Her courses and research focus on global social movements and paradigms of social change. She's participated and written about the global social justice movement and related transnational networks, in particular those affiliated with Apatismo and the World and the Regional Social Forums. And in addition to her academic work, she participates in various additional projects and activist endeavors, including being co-founder of the Carrboro Green Space and the journal Turbulence, Ideas for Movement. Michal, please come in.
Thank you. And I hope you don't mind if I take a moment outside of my 5-minute window to just invite everyone to feel their bodies for a moment. I mean, something I've been reflecting because I've been teaching online for several months now is that Zoom offers us this gift of connecting to people all over the world. And seriously, Jai, this is so moving to me to be back in conversation with people I used to see physically in Brazil and all over the world. But one of the things that Zoom, I think, is exacerbating is our being from here on up, which is very much a part of the modern ontoepistemic formation that Hina was speaking about, the idea that, everything is up here. And so to take a moment to feel your body as you listened to these talks, I think is a really, really important thing. And in fact, I'm not just saying that because I think it's important. I'm saying that because I think, to follow up on what Lawrence is actually inviting us to, one of the things that has been really exciting to me about movements and forms of organizing in the United States in particular, and this is actually a thread of organizing that came out of the US Social Forum and the World Social Forum, is a thread of organizing that is really looking at the gaps in how we have done organizing for, a long time. And one of those gaps that so many brilliant, largely women of color, have put forward is this idea of the importance of our hearts and our bodies in this process. And one of the reasons I think that people don't need more bad information thrown at them, right, is because there is a physiological response to that, right? And so some of the lessons coming from movements right now, and I think they're the ones that aren't as sexy and aren't being talked about as much, have to do with very mundane things. Like, one of my favorite phrases that isn't actually from the United States, but it really resonated here, is times are urgent, let us slow down. Times are urgent, let us slow down, right? Because it is the modern ontoepistemic default setting for us to, sorry, I forgot to put my timer on, to go, right? We have this endpoint, we want to get the revolution, we want to destroy capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Go, it's urgent, things are dire. And I have absolutely no qualm with the fact that things are dire. And yet increasingly, what I am moved to and moved by activists that are doing a lot of what might make some people uncomfortable, but they would call it spiritual or healing work, are inviting us to reside in that slower pace. And I find it really, really important. Some people have referred to this moment, right? And I think that it is very important for us not to see the context of COVID-19 and the massive uprisings as merely coincidental. I think I can't prove anything in some sort of like causal, way, but I would say that it is no surprise to me that we are finally dealing in a much more sustained way and having actual town councils in the United States say, let's defund the police, right? In a moment where our normal is completely up for questioning, right? And in a time when people are derailed enough to let themselves feel again. So I was really moved by your notes, Lawrence, but one of the things that I was thinking about is that for me, this time requires reflection, and it has been, as Jai mentioned, there's been so many amazing webinars happening, but it's asking for us to reflect not so much from the mind. It's asking us to reflect from our hearts and our bodies. And I know that this is kind of tricky and even scary to say in a time where people are just like flippantly dismissing science and logic, right? So I'm aware of that tension. And I still think that we need to recognize that the kinds of insights and logics for sustainable transformation of our societies can emerge in a way that's, for me, more akin to that which emerges out of a deep illness or depression or the practice of meditation. It is the kind of reflection that emerges out of intense discomfort in which the body and the heart, not the mind, are the sources of insight. Now, I say this, and that doesn't mean I dismiss the mind. It's just like, who's in charge, right? And so the mind is always there, and quieting the mind is a big thing, but also putting the mind, so there's a phrase in Colombia, they say, senti pensar, we have to feel, think, right? It's like, that needs to be the go-to, not feeling on top of thinking, right? So yeah, it's like we need to train ourselves, not just for the mental means of production, but to reclaim our heart, body, minds as a thing and be able to start to move from that place. And I think I want to stress what Hina was talking about, the civilizational crisis. A lot of movements from the global South, Black feminists and indigenous movements in the United States and Latin America in particular have talked about this moment as a moment of civilizational crisis. But what does that mean, right? What does it mean for our entire civilization to be up for grabs or just falling apart? And I would say that a lot of what it means is recognizing uncertainty, right? There's a really great quote from Ursula Le Guin that says, "The only thing that makes life possible is permanent, intolerable uncertainty, not knowing what comes next." Or Jack Halberstam, "We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn shit down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break. And both are necessarily different from the desire that issues from being in the break," right? So the mind doesn't like uncertainty, right? The mind, as we have known it in the West, and I really want to stress that I think that the crisis of our civilization is the crisis of Cartesian dualist ontoepistemic forms of being thinking, in which a particular form of rationality has been presumed to be able to lead us forward towards progress, towards development, towards all these things, right? So the dismantling or the falling apart of that, despite whether we want it to be in charge, is deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And this raises, I think, I wanted to make 2 points. I don't know if I have time for 2, so I might just make one of them. But that this coming up of uncertainty that I think this context really brings up for us, has been something I've seen as a pattern emerge, and it is a tension that I think a lot of us are talking about or touching on in this moment, but also elsewhere, about this very uncomfortable place of wanting to organize, right? But from this place in which we are also wanting to be present to the messiness, the falling apartedness, the unpredictability of what is, right? Because I've always been struck by this question of what is a movement? A movement, as Matt pointed out, is not just a bunch of organizations, right? It is this thing, to me, it's like, it's what reality becomes, right? It's like things come into motion when they are destabilized enough. And we don't just want instability, for sure. So this is why the tension, right? So we are looking for how we can use the instability in a more hopeful and liberatory way, rather than feeling paralyzed and terrified by it. And I love the metaphor that I heard among some of the activists that I used to work with, is like, there's this tension between letting ourselves become the foam at the tip of the waves versus like our propensity as good modern subjects, most activists are, right, to want to organize, to create the wave, right? It's like, how do we actually let ourselves become the foam on the tip of the waves? And finally, the last thing I'll say is that I think another reason why I think the COVID context is so important, not just as many people have brought up, and I completely think this is true because it is completely highlighted, put like an X-ray vision on the tremendous inequalities and dysfunctions of modern capitalism, but also because the topic of wellness is everywhere, right? And I think that framework, that logic, maybe we can think of it as a metaphor of what does being well look like, but also what does healing look like, as opposed or in kind of a playful tension with our other models of social change, or our other thinking of social change as complete revolution. Healing is, especially in a non-Western approach, healing is different, and it asks what is this illness teaching me? It asks, not how can I get rid of, root out the evil and the bad, but rather, reincorporated it or rebalance it into a different formation. So I've written longer pieces on all of these thoughts in some way, so I just wanted to share some thoughts, and I've gone too long, so I will leave it there. But I do love this quote that I do think this moment is calling us to, and I'm not going to say it perfectly, but the Zapatistas, who for me have always been a source of inspiration, they write, the world that we have, it's too hard to change. Let's build new ones, right? And I think that is a liberatory way of understanding the lack of control or uncertainty that we have, right? Where what comes on the other side is calling for our imaginations, right? It's calling for us to re-inhabit something less certain than a plan we can devise up here in our minds. Thanks.
Thank you, Mikhail. I think profoundly challenging. I'm sure all of us feel that. But this is, I think, precisely what we're talking about, to allow ourselves to be open to the uncertainty of all these questions. And this is what also conversation about movement can be about. Thank you. Our next speaker is Guillermo Delgado Pi. He's a lecturer of Latin American Ethnology and Field Studies Director at the Anthropology Department in the University of California, Santa Cruz in the US. And for 10 years, he served as the editor of the Bolivian Research Review. He's co-chair of the Indigenous Research Center of the Americas at the University of California, Davis. Guillermo, please join us.
Thank you, Jay, and greetings to all the participants of this webinar. I'm very pleased to hear all the great ideas and ways of summarizing what's happening in the world today. From the perspective of movement, as you remember, the piece I wrote for the volume was titled "A Paradox Government of Social Movements." And we are focusing on Bolivia, and as you know, in November, there was a major crisis in this country. The Evo Morales government was defeated, and this was a very important lesson for us, right? What happens when social movements go up in the government, try to change things, that they fall onto the same kinds of patterns that we were presumably fighting against, right? As a consequence of this, what we have now in Bolivia is a fascist government, a coup d'etat that has happened to destroy the indigenous movement thinking and proposals that are very much shown us to be an important point of reference in history. So, you know, this has allowed us to go back into the basics, right? One of the elements that has motivated the coming together of indigenous peoples has been the term dismemberment. And dismemberment as a term, and this is in relationship to what Mikhail was saying and Lawrence as well, has been a metaphor of understanding the destruction of peoples during the conquest of the Americas. It was a process of ontological dismemberment, not only of the indigenous body, but also of the ecological, environmental aspect of that moment of great crisis. So turning things around in terms of social movements inspirations, the term dismemberment has been shifted or changed into remembering. And remembering would be translating our capacity to come together. And I think that the dialogue that we've been building upon in this webinar is precisely that process that is showing us ways of coming together. In other words, of remembering. And remembering here is to recall the past, but also to come together as a people ontologically. And in this case, also, we are moving away from this anthropocentric view of looking at ontology and saying the land is alive. In other words, the land is also ontologically seen as an alive matter. So I think that these two terms that allows us to think about destruction and coming together can be seen motivating the social movements that we see today. What we have observed in the United States is precisely the dynamics of coming together, of remembering, because the Black Lives Matter social movement, for example, is precisely about that. It's recalling what has happened in the past. It's recalling the destruction that African heritage peoples in the Americas have been going through. linking this movement to the indigenous peoples, the feminist movements, and so on and so forth. The term can be utilized as a way of inspiring us to coming together after going back to see that indeed destruction processes of dismemberment historically has been happening, right? And so I think that as I hear the contributions of participants, Rose Brewer reminds us of this reference to Bernice Reagan, also ways of superseding constraints from the perspective of people organizing in the Santa Cruz, California area. We also are familiar with the notion of transcommunality. And this is a term that a colleague of mine, Afro-American sociologist John Brown Childs, has been talking about. Transcommunal social organizing is precisely what we are observing today, crossing gender limitations, opening up to interethnic dialogues, transnational dialogues, and so on and so forth. So I think that these two terms that I brought to your attention, dismembering, remembering, transcommunality, are the basis of what we see now happening in real life. And one of the frustrations that has triggered all these COVID quarantines is precisely the inability to see each other physically. And I think that social movements happen visibly and tangibly when we are on the streets, when we are marching on the streets. And this allows us to realize all these concepts that we are talking about that seem to be so distant, but can be appropriated in a very tangible way by people. So I think that lots of the ideas that people have already talked about are very much in the giving meaning to these dynamics. And of course, you know, I also noticed that there is a generational shift happening in the world. And so I'm open to listen to young people coming together on their own and leading us, you know, and maybe materializing the ideas that we talk about in a concrete way. Right? I think that this is enough. Let's hear other contributions. Thank you.
Guillermo, thank you so much for this. This has been such a pleasure. And this extraordinary idea of dismemberment and the violence that we associate of rememberment, of bringing members together. And it's such a beautiful idea. And I thank you for conversing, engaging with what others have said. I deeply appreciate this. This is wonderful to see. Thank you. I now would like to invite Ousenia Alidou to join us. Ousenia is Professor of Linguistics and African Studies in the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literature at Rutgers University in the US. She's based both in New Jersey and in Niamey in Niger. She's a leader in the African Studies Association and Association of Concerned African Scholars, and the recipient of numerous academic awards for her writing and research on Muslim women and post-colonial societies. She's also a long-standing activist as well as academic, and has organized both for women's rights and for an end to IMF, World Bank, neoliberal structural adjustment throughout the world. Ousenia, please join us.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and greetings to everyone. And thank you so much, Professor Sen and Professor Vargas and all the organizers. I'm really grateful, and I'm grateful to Brother Matt Myers for also inviting me to collaborate with you on this wonderful book project and also in this current meditation. And I want to say that my prayers is to peace and gratitude to those who contributed and who have departed earlier. So may their soul rest in peace. and we continue to celebrate their lives and be nourished through the legacy of their thought for us to continue with. So thank you, Sen, for that moment. I'm grateful to each one of you too for all I have learned today, and will continue to carry it in my own thinking and my work, and share it with communities of engagement. I'm coming from a place, both place physically, but also intellectually and philosophically, which is Africa, which very often does not figure in discourses regarding this current pandemic. And when Africa has often been used, it is in pandemic. But interestingly, this time, the location is different. And the achievement of Africans in terms of solving problems is not addressed. Not long ago with the Ebola pandemic, it was difficult for the global North to contribute urgently to stop the pandemic. We have to recall that. So the earlier stages were very critical in the amount of lives that were lost, just because people in the global North were not ready to step in urgently. However, there are lessons that could be learned from looking at how Africans responded to those earlier periods where lives were lost. And as our friend, comrade here, Lawrence Cox has mentioned, the role of global media, hegemonic media, in just producing images of lives being wasted. And when it's Black lives, when it's African lives, when it's indigenous in brown, it's just different. So as coming from that position, so the concept that Guillermo just mentioned to us, dismembering and remembering, which also Ngugi and others have mentioned, and Wangari Maathai, how African lives get dismembered because the land is coveted. The land is what hegemonic neoliberalism from colonial period, from the transatlantic period up to the 21st century went to appropriate. What we are dealing with now in the Sahel-Sahara region, where I come from, whether it's Niger, whether it's Mali, whether it's Western Sahara, whether it is the whole land, which was neglected during the colonial period because the colonial era thought that this is a barren land where it's not needed. There's nothing much to deal with. But today, because of what is underground, Africans' lives do not matter for the hegemonic appropriation of land, displacement of land, creation of war, displacement, wasting so many young people, mass migration, seeking a new life outside Africa. So if during the transatlantic slave trade and during the other trade, Africans were forced out, now, and the media recorded it as a way that Africans were transplanted forcibly. Now, the movement, neoliberalism, since the structural adjustment program from mid-80s to now, is forcing Africans to be the agent of their own expulsion outside the continent. And the Sahel-Sahara region today has been a theater of death. And crossing to the Mediterranean, Africans meet violent borders at the shore of the Mediterranean. And those who succeed to cross become also the ones who are disposable African bodies as refugees or as undocumented laborers joining Latin America and other worlds, South Asia, every part of the world, in factories. So the COVID, what is happening with COVID now, it is a pandemic that has been on the making for a long time. And yet those lives who are working, African refugees, if you go in Minnesota, you go in many other places, looking at the bodies of migrant laborers, you will find those Africans who, the ones who were displaced as refugees, were placed in a place where today with the pandemic, they have to fight for their lives to exist. So they become disposable lives, right? The idea, as we previous speakers have said, the ideas of which lives matter, which life is worth it to live, is definitely does not include African lives, African Americans, brown from all over, and indigenous population. So what is happening to me in the Sahel-Sahara and mirroring what is happening now, it's the perpetual violence that is following the course of history. So yes, it is important to recall this concept of dismembering and remembering, and see the ways in which we come and affirm life through this concept of transcommunality, that it is one life, in fact, and one life, one family, one community, one earth. What the COVID is saying is when we inflict the ecology, of course, there are other creatures. The COVID pandemic, for me, it's inviting us as human, to have humility, that we are not the only one to leave this earth. And these other creatures that we are displacing, yes, today the virus is affecting our lives. Yes, it has produced so much waste of lives. But imagine if we take care of nature, the nature will take care of us, and there will be a symbiotic relationship. Today in the Sahel-Sahara, there is no possibilities of thinking that way, because the environment is an environment polluted by mining companies. So radiation, even if the people are not displaced, radiation, because of exploitation and because of the ecological damage, uranium, petroleum, and then the mercury in the water, is such that people are forced to leave the space in order to survive. And leaving the space means you are going into scarcity of spaces and resources, which will create intercommunal conflict. So this very trope, the language of Africans fighting black, when I hear black on black crimes, people are refusing to recognize that black on black crimes is produced by the hegemonic forces that encroach on nature, that force individuals and communities to go against each other. There are certain communities in the world that the capitalist system does not recognize as worthy of affirming. And so what happens in the Sahel-Sahara today, in Mali, they produce religion, fundamentalism, as a tool through which they have to destroy communities. But African spirituality, whether it is indigenous spirituality or the Abrahamic religion, whether it is Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, has been something that communities have used in the absence of an affirmation to self-affirm. But now, hegemonic neoliberalism is using it both to produce youth in which they have not invested in education, because of structural adjustment program, African education has been destroyed. So the African youth do not have any means in terms of education, but to return to the very destructive structure by being absorbed as mercenaries to go fight wars outside even the continent. And now it's coming back to the continent. So fundamentalism is a fundamentalism to me that I see of neoliberalism, of capitalism. It is a religion that is very destructive, and we have to name it. And it also uses indigenous spiritualities in a very subversive, negative way to negate the lives of people by absorbing youth in a very militaristic way to come back in its own project of displacing and erasing African lives. This is what is taking place. And it has a patriarchal, misogynistic tendency, because we see how the people who get affected are women, the elderly. And one sees one's own child coming back as a violent soldier to destroy one's own community. And we know it is a project of displacement. The Sahel is coveted, and the Sahara, where it's not one Sahara. There is no division between Western Sahara, Northern Sahara, or Southern Sahara. It's a one place. It is the displacement, the destruction, because the land is coveted, the land below, the minerals. And now neoliberalism has pushed communities to adopt states and corrupt leaders to adopt land reform, whereby communal land that is supposed to create affirmation of communities, to produce privatization of land, where individuals can sell the land to multinational corporation, therefore continuing the dispossession of people. And so you see women and children trying to find lives outside their own land, where they become stateless, community, communal, unbelonging, and freedom everywhere. So what this movement is about is to really continue to be alert that this negation, the biopolitics, is a very negative one, and it has a color, it has a religion, in the sense that certain people cannot just be recognized as a human being. And this is what we are dealing with. So the pandemic, what we are experiencing as a COVID pandemic, Africa has been experiencing it for a long time. Structural adjustment program has destroyed African education. Structural adjustment has destroyed African land. Structural adjustment has destroyed public health. And this is what we are going for. So when people say, let's go to normalcy, I say, no, we don't want that normalcy. Because that normalcy has been violent for us. That normalcy has not been to recognize, to affirm African lives, whether you are from North Africa, South Africa, Central Africa. When you are African in the world, whether in the US, Latin America, everywhere, your life is disposable. And this is what is being brought to bear. And so I understand this solidarity. It has to really disengage. We don't want to go to the normal, the old normal, because the old normal is not a viable thing. We need a new present and a future of affirmation of all and global solidarity, where the below has to rethink what it means to not have it, to create new means in media, in education, in ways of sharing resources. Because neoliberalism is actually, COVID, unfortunately, is also creating a possibility for using the platform of remote education to say this is the future of how contingent labor in the educational field will be the new normal. So we just look at all this university, the life of universities. African universities have been destroyed. But the pattern that we are looking for now, where education will go online, will be the new normal. Is it what we want? Thank you.
Xenia, thank you for this. I apologize for our being in such tight time. We've actually way overrunning times already. Thank you for recognizing that this session is as much as anything else a meditation, and for bringing out the victimization of Africa and of Africans, and so graphically and so powerfully. I'd now like to request Johanna Fernandez to come in. Johanna teaches 20th century US history and the history of social movements at the Department of History in Baruch College, if I'm pronouncing that right, in CUNY, City University of New York. Her book, The Young Lords, A Radical History, was published in February 2020. And she's also in 2015 directed and co-curated Presente, The Young Lords in New York, an exhibition, which was cited by the New York Times as one of the year's top 10. And she's done many other things, including a suit against the New York Police Department that led to recovery of lost files. Johanna, will you please join us?
Thank you so
activist, as scholar.
Thank you very much for organizing this forum and for bringing so many people together. And this is not an easy commentary or summing up of what I've heard, because there's been so much. But I want to start perhaps with what Xenia ended. And I think Xenia's presentation is critical because I think she might have been the only person to identify the problem as capitalism. And I'm sure that we all agree, even if we didn't mention it, but that is not something that can be footnoted. That has to be up close to our analysis and central. Part of what Xenia said was that the pandemic has opened up a crisis that the neoliberals and capitalists are going to use to push through their agenda. And we're seeing that happen in education, but we're also seeing it happen in healthcare, happening in healthcare. The pandemic, however, has done something else. And a number of you alluded to it, but because it has amplified mortality, it has brought so many of us closer to the human. So on the left, or among people who are not necessarily wedded to the system or who are exploited by the system, for people who have a heart, as Michal stresses that we tend to, the pandemic has clearly shown that capitalism doesn't have a heart and that the system is willing to let people die. And that the state, which is supposedly there to save us, is actually going to throw us under the bus. So the pandemic is critical in this moment because it is actually splitting society. It is giving neoliberalism a new lease on life and a new means of operating in the world, and could even potentially be the means through which the global economy gets moving again, because it's creating crisis, but it also is creating a fight back. There is also talk now about the crisis of civilization. There's a civilizational crisis. And that's different for the left, because the left, we always talk about a world in crisis. Now we're talking about civilization in crisis. And I think that part of what has been happening is that, again, the depravity of the system has been amplified. And we've been talking about the depravity of the system for a minute, right? There was 9/11. Before there was 9/11, there were massive movements that addressed many of the issues that were discussed happening in Africa, structural debt. Did I say Chiapas? There was an uprising in Chiapas. 9/11 happened. All of the movements went to sleep. But then Occupy Wall Street happened, which made it legitimate to criticize capitalism. That followed, or what followed after that was the beginnings of Black Lives Matter, which is not a recent thing. It actually started immediately with the end of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So part of what we've seen happening is that a series of movements have actually created different standards and different discourses. And we see a heightening of that in this moment. So this is important because it seems that at least among a section of society, there's a pretty advanced understanding of the problem, even if in general, in a general discussion. So what are those problems? The environment, right? The dismemberment of the environment, its destruction. There's a lot of unanimity around that. A willingness to dismember entire peoples, right? The system's willingness to dismember entire peoples, like Black Americans, but also indigenous people, people from Palestine. And we've seen those people rise up. And again, the pandemic has exacerbated the crisis and laid the depravity of capitalism bare. There's also an economic crisis of epic proportion that preceded all of this. We now know that some crazy percentage of people around the world, something like 60%, are living under precarious conditions. And that precarity has come to the United States, right? One of the reasons why we have a president like Trump is because there's been a massive economic displacement of white Americans who previously thought of themselves as not the people who are going to be displaced by the system. And this crisis has created the possibility for a reactionary far right-wing agenda to be organized. So what we have are two things at this moment. We have a far right-wing agenda that is exemplified by Trump, but that we saw emerging a lot earlier around the world, France, Europe, Brazil, and elsewhere. And now that far right-wing agenda has organizational capacity and structure. And we're seeing that in the United States. But we also have these uprisings that are phenomenal and unlike anything we've seen before, in part because the demands they are putting forth require revolution. Abolishing the police requires a revolution. Even defunding the police mildly requires a revolution, just to talk about the American example. So we also have a situation in Minneapolis in which a police station was burnt to the ground, and 54% of Americans said that it was okay and justified. So we have uprisings that in many ways are suggesting that revolution is the only solution, in part because the demands that they're raising can only be brought about through revolution, but we don't necessarily have revolutionary organization or even deep revolutionary analysis, which gets us to Lawrence's very, very important point, but also Matt's, who said that uprisings are not necessarily movements. What we have not seen, at least not in the United States, and we here in the United States don't get enough information about what's going on in the rest of the world. We have not seen hegemonic organizations, even radical organizations that we can point to, that are identifying analyses, strategy, and the kind of world we want to see. We saw that in the 1960s, right? Here in the United States, there were a laundry list of organizations that became hegemonic, respected, were on the ground all the time, had a target, had demands, and an analysis, and a world, a vision, an imaginary of where to go. We don't have any of that, in part because neoliberalism, in part, has made it its assignment to destroy organization, people's organizations, organizations from below, and replace them with 501c3s. That's essentially one of the projects of neoliberalism over the last 50 years. So we have possibility in terms of building a new world, but the possibility of repression coming down hard on us is also great in the absence of a strategy that will identify what is the force in society that could help us defeat capitalism once and for all. Historically, that's been the working class. In the United States right now, our movements have begun to inspire elements within the working class to take a stand, but the working class and its organizations are incredibly weak. And at this point, that is really the only force that could push back a far right-wing violent repression against the movements, which could very well happen, and we see happening already. So this question of strategy and organization is critical to this moment. And what we see happening, which is amazing, are phenomenally courageous networks of people, and that's pretty much what the Black Lives Matter movement is. Loose networks of organizations and people that are putting forth a vision. But if we are going to fight the state, we're going to need something more definitive and less, ambiguous. The state knows what it wants and it is going to do it under Biden or under Trump in the United States. We need a comparable determination to build structures and organizations that are going to offer analyses that are not going to be timid about calling the problem capitalism and colonialism, which is going to continuously seek land and places to invade and exploit. And we need a new world organized. The only thing that we know, because it's the only thing that has existed, is socialism. And socialism, contrary to popular opinion, was an idea that emerged out of indigenous societies. So we don't know that Marx and all those who talked about socialism, they got the idea from indigenous societies and the ways in which they were organized. So we need organization, we need a target and analysis of how the system works, but we need a clear, defined vision of what it is that we're fighting for, what it looks like, but what are the forces in society that could actually defeat the advent of the repressive glove and fist of the state, which is coming. And of course, I'll just end by saying that we see phenomenally courageous uprisings in the United States, but we have a very short memory. The last site of the phenomenal uprising was in Chile. And it was fiercer than here in the United States. And I'm sure in other places. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Johanna. Well, it's impossible to keep on talking about superlatives or sort of the power of what you've said and in the engagement with everything that what others said, but thank you for this. I have to, firstly, I thank all the speakers collectively. We are, of course, running way behind time, but I think it was extremely important to let this open up. I think that it's gone way beyond what I had understood might happen here. And it is, I think, a powerful base from which to go, a huge challenge for us in terms of conceptualizing further steps in what we do. The idea was that we would now move to questions and answers. We actually have only 2 questions that have come forward. And on the other hand, we're on a time crunch. We've already 25 minutes over time, roughly. So I think we'll restrict it really to these. One question was from Joe Ramsey, which was, how can the organizing capacity that Lauren spoke about be reconstructed? I'm not sure these are questions we can answer completely here, but I think it's important to ask speakers, how can the organizing capacity that Lauren spoke about be reconstructed? What exists now that can be built upon and what new is needed. And what lessons from the past organizing on this front need to be taken to heart, positive and negative. I'd like to open this to the speakers. If you would like to start with this, perhaps opening it first to where we started, in a sense, and then either Hina or Matt, if you have something to say.
Well, I guess I'll just say briefly, I unfortunately have to leave now. In a minute, I was actually about to type something in chat to say goodbye to everyone. But just to say, mainly to my fellow speaker, Mikhail, as the person who first brought up this sort of quote that I think you said about capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, I fully also agree with the point about healing and indigenous, especially indigenous issues. And I can only think of my dear comrade Wendy Marshall, who is a leader in the Black Caucus of People's Strike, and is, like many of us, a balance between academic and activist and organizer, whose pivotal work, a book called Potent Mana, is looking at indigenous Hawaiian healing and resistance to colonization and US empire. So all of the things that I think have been said through all of the threads of the conversations from the very beginning through Johanna's last words. And by the way, I should also note that Johanna and I share this little space in an institute called the A.J. Musty Institute. So it's lovely to see each other in this setting away from those board meetings. But to just say that we, all of us, need to be more disciplined about the space we take up, especially those of us from the global north, those of us who are white and male and of European descent. So when we run over time like this, we have to be self-critical. This is an open space, and this is meant to be a conversation which we will not be able to have today. However, the website suggests, and the e-list that Joy masterfully runs, suggests ways of continuing the conversation even when this webinar ends. And maybe more specifically, I'll end with this. We have intentionally made this the first of a series, and we're excited about the idea that on September 4th, we will be having another in this series called Building International Movements of Movements. What should be our next steps? So this is very much a to be continued. And that to be continued, by the way, I assure you, if we have anything to say or do about it, it will be more participatory with fewer speakers and more time for discussion. And right now we do have two amazing people, Kali Akuno and Sylvia Federici, joining us on September 4th. So we hope all of you do as well. And it's been wonderful hearing my comrades and colleagues, and thank you all for participation.
Thank you, Matt. And with apologies to everybody, many of you, some have left already, but for bearing with us. But thank you for Matt for bringing the end forward and what we wanted to put forward to the audience. Can I ask Hina, would you like to respond, or Lawrence, since you were spoken to?
I'll say just one thing, maybe briefly, which connects perhaps with what Mikhail said. We have a rich history of many different kinds of institutions of discussion, but one of the things that I think we need most is the fuller encounter with each other. So less rhetoric, less speechifying at each other, less talking at each other as if it was our usual audiences, and more time in which we can actually get a sense of what the other person is really saying, what the reality behind their rhetoric, their discourse is. I'm not sure how we achieve that on Zoom or indeed on the written page. But certainly in organizing practice, that time, not so much with people who are relatively like us, as the time with people who are radically unlike us and are therefore the allies that it is hardest to get, but who are biggest gains to make. That's a more 360-degree encounter, but I don't have a suggestion as to how to achieve it.
Thank you, Lawrence. I think that this, I think we are going to have to rethink how we do these things. Eusenia and Guillermo, do you have any responses to the questions that were and the issues that were being raised?
So just one little detail on the way we operate. I remember that we used to talk about locality. And I think that we should retrieve this term. Locality is the global, but also the local. Since the local is so important, this is the nearest experience that we can lively incorporate into our own kinds of bodies, as Mikhail was saying. So local views, right? Rather than just global or local. Local views, I think this is a useful term.
Michal, do you have anything? Oh, sorry, Eusenia. I was asking Eusenia if you had something to add, and then I want to ask Michal.
Oh, yeah.
Eusenia?
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate this conversation where the global and local can be in dialogue over healing. What are the healing mechanisms that Mikhail is talking about? The different perspectives, different approaches. So when we are in conversation with each other through those two prisms, we can arrive at a viable possibilities and continue to explore. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm thank you for this. Eusenia, we are all suffering from exhaustion this time, and I think we have to be drawing this to an end. I wonder, Michal, since so many have spoken to you, and then finally I'd like to come back to Hina, if she would like to add, if you'd like to add something to close.
Well, I don't think that I have to add. I think everything has been very, very interesting. I recover the feeling from our body and not necessarily the rationality. And I think that we're not winning, as Lawrence says, but I think also that there are a lot of signs that are so important in this process that we are doing. Hey, telephone. Okay, sorry. Well, and I am very much willing to be together in the 4th of September. And I also think that we can make a kind of little summary of what has been the most important thing. Somebody's putting my door. Just a minute, please. Sorry.
Michal, do you have something to say?
I have lots to say and there's no time. So I'll just say I love the questions that we are ending with. And I mean, for me, this being in the tension of like organizing, strategizing while allowing ourselves to dissolve into the movement uncertaintiness is a really exciting and terrifying, but important place to sort of be, right? So it's like, how do you hold a vision and strategy that is open to the uncertainty and the multiplicity and the fact that we actually have to dismantle or undo but parts of ourselves, right, as subjects of Western capitalist modernity, especially those of us in the global North, white-bodied people. So just how do we do that? While I completely agree, we need to have vision, we need to have strategy, we need to have imagine, so it's just a exciting and challenging like precipice to be at. And I do think the glocal, but I increasingly, I mean, I think there's like being stuck at home makes you talk to people also that you might like. I'll talk a lot more to my neighbors than I might have previously. And I think there's a lot to be learned, right? Not just from organizers, but from who you live next door to that aren't, you know, that might wear a MAGA hat and, or not, hopefully, in my, you know. So just some thoughts. I could ramble on.
Of course. Can I ask finally, Johanna, if you have comments? And if you're still with
yes, I think that what we need to do in part during these sessions is in fact invite people on the ground who are organizing and holding down local struggle. So there have been some people who've been occupying City Hall in New York City, demanding the defunding of the police. They've been there for 2 or 3 weeks. I know that there are probably lessons to be learned that they've not had the opportunity to process, but they surely would come to talk about their experience. I just want to reiterate the idea that, that all movements are local and all organizations emerge from local struggle, but also radical reforms. So that's how we get to radical reforms. What is it that people need at the local level, and how could we push for the most radical possible articulation of a need without subverting our movements locally and organizations to the project of electoralism, which is often the case. So a conversation about radical reforms and how do we get them, because that's part of what we're going to need to gain the confidence to rebuild our organizations and actually build sustained movements that are more than episodic uprisings.
Well, I think I'm asked you to speak right at the end because I think in a way you've played that role once and you've done it again. And I think summing up these points that you're putting to us, I think both at one level, what we collectively in our various capacities need to do, but also a challenge to us as organizers of such initiatives. I'm not taking it personally, but also others. There were 2 or 3 people who are hosts of other of these major conversations. Ashish Kothari was here for a while. He's left now, but I point this out to him that there needs to be time and space for the local to be able to talk, to articulate. We need to be able to finding ways. He has posted, incidentally, a link in the chat of wonderful collections they have put together of alternative formulations from across the world, and which I urge you all to look at, but I think we have to carry this forward. I think we have to bring this to an end. Matt was in fact going to play the key role in doing this. Hina has already, in a way, pointed out certain issues that we need to be looking at. So I'm going to just close by sort of pointing out 2 or 3 things. One is this has been an extraordinarily rich, richer I think than my imagination took me, of not only thoughts but also feelings that we've explored. And it's been stunning actually the degree to which it has been at the level of feeling at which the register has come through here so strongly. But yet at the level of challenge to organization, and the question that Lawrence has raised about we have to look at whether we're winning, and we're not winning. So, and that Johanna has engaged with, that Osenia has engaged with, of the limitations of what we are doing, and therefore to carry forward from there, not to accept that, but to look at this in a very hard way. So I think this poses conceptual challenges for anything that we do to follow up. Matt has announced what we had in mind. I think we're now going to have to go back to our think boxes and think about whether we can sustain such a next meeting, whether that should be the next meeting. The second is that I do hope that we can organize translation so that we can bring a wider range of participants in. And I think that's very important too. Third, I'd like to repeat Matt's invitation to everybody to please use the website, the Movements of Movements website, as a space. We are going to increasingly structure it so that others can have space to be able to take space there, to inhabit it and use it to your own strategic purposes, for conversation, for discussions, for conversations across speakers and movements. We'll try and be an open space in of itself. Similarly, he's also mentioned, I don't like making a plug for it, but there's this listserv called the World Social Movement Discuss listserv, which you can also look up, which many here already do use, and we invite all of you to join. It has this year matured into, I think, a much more multi-generational and multicultural engagement with movement happening across the world. And also, I'm thankful to say, in more than one language. Finally, I'd like to invite all the speakers, certainly, if you would put together your thoughts and presentations in notes for us, challenging us, questioning us meaning the organizers, but that we can also post. Because you got your thoughts organized, and for instance, Johanna, but also others, if you can put those down, then we can use that as a base to carry forward. So if in the next, say, 2 or 3 weeks, if you could please try and get this together. I know all of you are under tremendous pressure, but it would be very valuable. I want to say, Joseph Ramsey asked if there is going to be a record. There is, so far as the entire event has been recorded, that will be posted, made available to everybody. Similarly, the chat will be recorded, and we'll see whether that needs editing in any form, just to make it less long and make that available. But I think that it's important that we carry this thing forward together. And if any of you, and this is an invitation to speakers as well as to the audience, have proposals for how to carry this forward, how you would like to carry it forward, and how we can work together. We already have one from Ashish Kothari of how this can relate to initiative that he is one of the coordinators of, called the Global Tapestry for Alternatives. Please do consider. Suren, let me point you to the chat, has just pointed out ways of subscribing to the WSM list.